Hello! Welcome to Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance news of the week. I'm Felix Salmon of Axios with Elizabeth Spiers of the New York Times.
Hello.
With Emily Peck of Axios Markets.
Hello, Felix.
Make sure that you're subscribed. And oh my God, do we have an amazing show this week. We have the most fun, but also probably the most wonkish show that we've had in a long time with the one and only Mehrsa Baradaran. Mehrsa, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back.
You are one of our favorite guests, if not our absolute favorite guest on this show. Every time you come on, you drop just astonishing amounts of knowledge. But introduce yourself. Who are you?
I'm Mehrsa Baradaran. I'm a law professor, and I believe that Slate Money was my first podcast with my first book, and I came to your offices in Brooklyn, and it was such a fun time. I remember sitting there being like, oh my gosh, if writing a book is getting to talk to people like this, then I'm going to do more books. So I'm so happy that I'm back.
So you're now on book 3, right?
Yes.
So what was book 1? What was book 2? But most importantly, what is book 3?
Book 1 was How the Other Half Banks, and your subscribers can go probably in your archives. We talked about it there, about postal banking and all of that, and we talked a lot about that on your podcast. And then the second book was The Color of Money, which is about the racial wealth gap. And this third book is called The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America.
So this is part of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a lot about neoliberalism, what it is, how it works, when it started, its racial roots. We are also going to talk about what just happened at the FDIC, how important the FDIC is, how important the OCC is, how sad it is that Mehrsa Baradaran is not running the OCC.
I dodged a bullet.
We're going to talk about bank balance sheets. We are going to talk about Basel Endgame. We have a whole Slate Plus segment about PG&E and Jewish space lasers. It's awesome. It's all coming up on Slate Money.
This episode is brought to you by La Quinta by Wyndham. Your work can take you all over the place, like Texas. You've never been, but it's going to be great because you're staying at La Quinta by Wyndham. Their free Bright Side breakfast will give you energy for the day ahead. And after, you can unwind using their free high-speed Wi-Fi. Tonight, La Quinta. Tomorrow, you shine. Book your stay today at lq.com.
So, Mehrsa, you are a law professor, and you have written a book about neoliberalism and the interesting new kind of provocative thread that runs through this book is that neoliberalism is not really an economic thing. It's a legal thing. Have I got that right?
Yeah. And in fact, I think, not that I think, but sort of what I've been writing in all my books is that the market is a legal thing also. I mean, you see this in crypto and the new asset formations and the derivatives market. It's all first the law has to encode something and then it becomes an asset class. And so I'm extending that, larger in one way, but also that neoliberalism literally was a legal project. It was a movement to change the law to favor certain types of corporations over other certain asset classes over people, things like that.
So you say in the book that this isn't a kind of conspiracy theory, but you also say that it's a movement. So who was behind this movement and what were they trying to achieve?
The conspiracy was sort of out in public. Everything I'm saying is not insinuation. It's like this happened. And then, there's a memo written. So Lewis Powell is one of the major contributors, but he's a little bit even later than, Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, not as Fed chair, as Nixon advisor on race in the 1960s. Bizarre. That's where I kind of, after in The Color of Money, I was in the Nixon archives and I see this memo from Alan Greenspan and Color of Money, I spent a whole chapter 6 on this. And it was just because I found this memo by Alan Greenspan. I was like, why is Alan Greenspan writing Nixon in 1967 about the urban crisis? And it is because there was this group of sort of neoliberals. And it wasn't necessarily coordinated. It did get so more in the Nixon administration. At first, it was like the Mont Pelerin Society guys, Hayek, Milton Friedman, Posner in the law, and the money that supported them. And then as, Brown versus Board of Ed happens, the 60s happens, Nixon is trying to come up with a strategy. Part of a Southern strategy is like, look, go at Wallace voters on one hand, right? With the soft racism, but also you've got to do something about the global justice movements and the civil rights movements that are at this point being linked. And the thing that he does is take on this old, I guess, neo-capitalism, neoliberal ideology and infuse it into policy. And really what it was just kind of saying, oh, you want freedom? How about market freedom? You want black power, black capitalism. It was a real rhetorical war that was happening at this time where, and they admit to it later on a lot of parts, but then it becomes not so much about, okay, who's doing what behind the scenes. Then once they sort of unleash capital, then capital itself becomes a self-reproducing idea and like sort of, it has a gravity of its own.
This is what everyone is talking about, like superintelligent AI is going to become like sentient and they're going to take over the world. And I'm like, wait, hang on a sec. Like, neoliberalism is already a superintelligent AI. It has taken over the world. No one controls it anymore.
Exactly. I don't understand what you mean by unleash the markets. Like, I understand black capitalism and how kind of that whole thing was insidious because I read your last book, Color of Money. But yeah, I don't understand unleash the markets exactly.
So what they would say is like, oh, we're going to deregulate the market, and so we're going to take the government down and whatever. That isn't exactly what happened. What did happen was all the barriers that were placed around capital. So during the Bretton Woods Accord, from 1940, until 1971, when Nixon eradicated it, capital, if you had investors in one nation, you couldn't invest in another nation, right? So there were borders around capital. And then there was a cap on how much capital could grow. And I'm simplifying it, but, there were usury caps. There were, income taxation. There was all sorts of capital regulation. In banking especially, there was a lot of risk regulation that kept capital like growing slower, right? Because capital is this idea that, right, it grows fast and all capital, it's like an AI, like Felix said, if you program an AI to just like multiply itself at 6% a year, 7%, 20%, whatever capital is gaining now, and then don't come back to revise it, what's going to happen is it's kind of metastasizing on one end.
And it becomes fungible. Like, I think this is one of the things that people don't realize today, because it is just a basic fact of life these days that money is fungible and that a dollar, here is exactly the same as a dollar there. And it's very hard for people to remember that historically, pre-Nixon, that wasn't true. That if you had a dollar in a bank in Arkansas, it was not exactly the same as a dollar at a bank in Vienna or in New York.
Wait, what? A dollar in Arkansas wasn't the same as a dollar in New York?
Correct.
Why?
Okay, so but basically the banks were geographically constrained. They would take in deposits from people who are local. They would lend out locally according to state law. And the ability of capital to do things like maturity transformation and lending and all of these like fundamental things to the banking system was highly localized, and different banks in different states would operate in very different ways. And my very first job in journalism was working for a magazine called Euromoney in London, which was named after the Euro markets. And the Euro markets were born in, I think, 1977 with a bond that was issued by an Italian infrastructure company. Someone's going to write in and correct me on this. But basically, the idea was that the Eurobonds, the thing that was invented in the late 70s was this thing called the Eurodollar, which was dollars held outside the US. And you would have European companies borrowing dollars from European investors. And Eurodollars were very interestingly and importantly different animals to US dollars. And there were two very different markets, and they were taxed very differently, and they had very different return expectations, and they had very different regulations around them. And very rapidly, the Euro markets expanded, and you found a bunch of American companies like creating European subsidiaries to borrow money in Europe because they didn't have the same regulations as they had in the United States. And eventually, all of the regulations kind of fell away, and all of the companies incorporated in Delaware, and all of the banks, wound up being regulated by the OCC, which we're going to talk about later. But for a long time, pre-1980 or so, none of that was true, and everything was much more localized.
Then there's this technology story, right? The ATM is invented in 1969, right? It was before that, you really were state by state. In 1978, the first case about sort of usury caps goes to the Supreme Court. 1978, it's Marquette. And it's like, can a bank chartered in one state lend to another state? And what laws apply, right? And Lewis Powell, the guy that is one of my heroes or villains in my story, takes that case on. And it's Robert Bork that argues it. And people kind of just ignored this case because it was right. They ignored this case because it had nothing to do, it was like a unanimous court. I mean, you have Thurgood Marshall siding with Lewis Powell on this because they didn't understand the weight of it, which was to basically deregulate usury caps nationwide after that case. And this case was partly led by this. Citibank, went to South Dakota or North Dakota. I keep forgetting. I think it's South Dakota. And then put their credit card office there, brought 80,000 jobs, but then exported that rate nationwide. And from there, it was like a race to the bottom. Utah, Idaho, the Dakotas completely deregulated interest rates. Delaware became obviously the hub. It had been before, but more supercharged. And so now you've got these hubs of, Delaware there, White Plains bankruptcy court where like PG&E and the Sacklers, the Purdue Pharma went. Like, it's basically, you can choose your court, you can choose your jurisdiction, you can choose your law if you're connected in the right way. So it's not unleashing the market. It's basically saying, we'll work with you. Like, whatever you want to happen, you just kind of like make it work in the district that you want. And first it's through federalism, and then it's through regulatory capture. But the whole time, the ideology that they're presenting the public is free market capitalism. And not just that, it's free market capitalism tied in with the threat to free market capitalism is these poor people, welfare, all the Black civil rights, the feminists, blah, blah, blah. And meanwhile, they're calling this corruption free markets. And what ends up being produced on this theory of, we're going to reduce the laws is like a massive regulatory state, like ballooning laws. Like Dodd-Frank is 2,000 pages compared to Glass-Steagall. You've got 12 banking laws passed during the Reagan administration. Nixon creates 6 different agencies. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, along with the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, to put a cost benefit analysis on every law. So basically, the law, you were like, we're going to protect the environment, but we're going to add this whole complex infrastructure around it, such that not only are we pretending to regulate the environment, even though we're not, but we're going to basically hobble these agencies with these bullshit metrics. It's hard to describe neoliberalism without using the word bullshit. Because it's almost like the opposite. If you put a neo in front of liberalism, it's like the opposite of liberalism. That's kind of the effect of this.
So besides Powell, who do you consider the architects or the primary architects of all of this? Who can we blame?
It happens in the Nixon White House. It's Nixon, Lewis Powell, it's Kissinger, Alan Greenspan, because there's two arms. There's one is, how do we keep these brown people like in empire, under different names? So that's like a Kissinger kind of deal. And then there's the, how do we spin out bullshit to like convince people that this is for their benefit? Because how do you take away democracies from people and their welfare states, without saying it? So Milton Friedman is very convincing. He's just like this most articulate, like bullshitter that we've ever had. And Hayek gets the blame, but I actually see Hayek as kind of an old guy at this point. He's irrelevant a little bit. Like his ideas are good. And he actually is more of a true believer than the other guys. Ayn Rand
You don't think that Friedman and Greenspan were true believers? You think they were like cynically selling something for their
question with
paymasters?
Everybody, and this is like, it started with Elon Musk, is, are they bad or are they dumb? And I don't know, honestly. Like, I asked this of all these people. I don't know. It's not, but like Elon, is he bad or just dumb? Like, does he not see it, or is he just like evil? I don't think he's evil. So I don't think Greenspan is evil. I just think he didn't see what was convenient not to see.
But let's go back, and because since you found this memo, let's talk about it. Like, what is it fair to say that he invented affirmative action?
George Shultz invented affirmative action, but Alan Greenspan invented black capitalism, which is essentially the same thing, right? And he's basically saying, so there's all of these riots in the 60s. Riots, first of all, they're protests for the most part. The cops come in. It's like the student protesters. It becomes a riot when the cops come in with guns often. And maybe sometimes it's a riot, but there's this, they call it the urban crisis in general. And it's very clear that something has to be done. So we're coming at the 68 election, right? It's like Johnson's leaving. It's like Robert Kennedy. There's all of these plans, and the Senate is meeting like 100 times. And I did, I read everything for Color of Money. And there really is like just two main things here. You can integrate. That's how you can, get past Jim Crow and segregation. Mind you, this was the law of the land for hundreds of years. So how do you reverse generations of segregation? So one is to integrate using public policy. The other is just to pay reparations or use Fed money. And this is the thing. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to take money from this pot and put it into this pot. It was very clear that the Fed could make money at that point because they're going to the weapons manufacturers as it is now. You could just fuel money. Like, one of the ideas was to create something like an import-export bank, like a World Bank model or Marshall Plan, into the inner cities and just fuel money there. And there was no cost. There was no cost to the balance sheet, but it would have taken away the race angle for Nixon. That's kind of how cynical it was, is if you fix racism, how will we get elected? And because the Southern strategy was really based on stirring up these white grievances, because the real core of it was wanting to take away sort of democratic power over financial markets to put it into these little cabins of expertise. So Alan Greenspan comes in, looks at the urban crisis and says, these people are saying that they're exploited. And it's this whole actually kind of 8-page memo about, while racism exists, it's not called exploitation because it's unprofitable to lend into the ghetto, which is true. Right? But it's unprofitable because it's been segregated and exploited for so long. So then Greenspan basically says what you should do is call it any of these things as anti-capitalist. And the answer is to help them help themselves. Okay. And he's not as racist as someone like George Stigler, who writes an op-ed around this time that says basically Black people aren't getting jobs because they're not employable, right? Why, instead of asking for things, why don't you look inside and figure out why you're not good enough to get hired? That's a George Stigler Nobel Prize winner, Chicago, So, but that was the vibe. I mean, Milton Friedman gets his, entree into public life right after Brown by writing about school choice, capitalism and freedom. If you read the whole thing, it's about anti-integration, right? This is what the platform of these neoliberals. It was about Brown and the civil rights era. And they're using these ideas of capitalism to say you should not do that. And it starts in South Africa, actually. Yeah.
So just to be clear, the idea is that if we throw money at the inner cities, then that means we don't need to integrate them, and that means that we get to keep the white racists on our side. So I do need to ask, as the Brit in the room, I don't know how much you read about this, and this might be a very unfair question to throw at you out of the blue, but what happened with Thatcher and Thatcherism in the 80s in the UK? Because I feel that whatever the reason for, whatever the sort of racial reasons behind what Nixon did, those weren't the reasons for what Thatcher did. And Thatcher was very much at the vanguard of the neoliberal revolution in Europe.
Absolutely. So most people who write about neoliberalism, this is kind of my intervention, me speaking to other people who know already a lot about neoliberalism, which is you. Most people pin neoliberalism to Reagan and Thatcher, and it's like the free market revolt. And it was neoliberalism. I'm taking it a little bit back to Enoch Powell and Nixon and those guys here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will quickly jump in and say that Enoch Powell was a very notorious Tory MP who was pretty much the last MP in Britain to be explicitly racist and just like not even ashamed of it.
Well, yeah, he gives this speech in 1968 because this is like the revolt. This is the era, right? He says, so it's called the Rivers of Blood speech because he says basically he was like he was an Indian, whatever they called it in Britain, where you go to India and
an old India hand.
Yeah, he like ruled India for a while and he like missed it. He like really wanted the Britain to keep India, so he's like devastated by that, and he's like terrified that all these Indians are moving to Great Britain. And so he gives a speech like, if we don't stop this, our rivers will be filled with blood, like these, and that they will come and they will, what is the word? Like basically spoil our blood. Like they will like interbreed and our blood will no longer be pure and there will be violence. And it's like this crazy
replacement theory
speech. Yes, exactly. But in 1968, he gives that speech. I think he's asked to resign. Maybe there's a controversy. And he then, at end of that year, he speaks to the Mont Pelerin Society about monetary policy. And he's basically arguing, and I'm putting those speeches back to back, and I'm like, they're not exactly the same, but he's like, our currency will be devalued. Okay. So it's like, it's a very similar thing. And it's the same thing that Milton Friedman is doing here. It's like, if these Black people come into our schools, it will devalue our race. You can't say that anymore. But what you can say is to like put a lock around the levers of state power. You can't have democracy, right? Like you can maybe get the things, but you can't be in this. It's like you're just protecting the levers of power from these people. And that's what the Mont Pelerin Society is about. Their first meeting is, there's all these democratic revolts. How do we make sure they never get their hands on the money lever? So that's essentially where Enoch Powell goes. And then by Reagan and Thatcher, when Reagan comes to office, the Heritage Foundation fills every post. And when Thatcher goes in, it's like the American Enterprise Institute, all the right-wing think tanks that start during Nixon are already set up to really full-scale completely revise and change the economy by Thatcher Reagan. So yes, that is the embodiment. That is like the rollout of full-scale economic neoliberalism, but the nub of it is earlier. And I think we miss it because it's like, well, what does it have to do with race if you're starting then? And why? Why would you, go all free markets? And people say, oh, it was inflation, right? That's the typical story. And so I take it back, and not everyone may be convinced. Like I'm excited for people to kind of wrestle with, because I'm changing the date because I see it differently. So
it predates the inflation shock of the 70s, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Volcker was
a civil rights shock, basically.
It's a civil rights shock. Yeah. Global, and a global justice shock. Yeah.
Surely all of us can feel gratitude and pride toward American capitalism. Its record of improving human welfare is unmatched in all history.
When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. It has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/slate. That's linkedin.com/slate to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Mehrsa, I really want to ask you about another part of your personal history, which comes up briefly in the book, which is that for a while there, for quite a long while, in fact, you were the Biden administration's nominee to take over the OCC, which is one of the most important bank regulator positions in the United States, if not the most important. The OCC basically regulates most of the big banks. Most of the banks, I should say. And so, apropos what you were just saying about like the thing that you don't like about neoliberalism is the way that it is dominated by these massive federal agencies. What would your agenda have been? What would you have liked to have done there?
So there's several key, parts of the party, and I was the Senate. So the Senate nominates each of the nominees. So I got a call from Brown and Senator Brown and Warren, the banking committee, saying, you're our nominee. And then I was vetted for like 9 months, and somewhere between, and then I was on the transition team over the Fed and the Treasury and, with Gary Gensler and those guys. And I still don't know exactly who put the kibosh on it, but I also couldn't believe that they were going to do it. I mean, the thing with the OCC is that there's so much power in this agency, and the power, it's like, you don't have to go to the Senate. You don't have to make law. You can basically write interpretive letters on the derivatives market, right? And just say, yes, you can do derivatives by, because it counts as the business of banking. The OCC is charged with interpreting the National Banking Act, which says banks shall only do the business of banking. And so banks will go to the OCC, and I did this as a bank regulatory attorney, and say, is this the business of banking? And typically, before neoliberalism, the OCC would be like, the business of banking is lending and deposit taking. And then anything outside of that, like you can't sell insurance, you can't do things that are outside. And then during neoliberalism, there became this like really tight partnership between banks and the OCCs, whereby they would just say, we want to do derivatives because it hedges our risks. And the OCC would be like, sure. So they'd write these interpretive letters about their own law without any rulemaking, no vote, no public input, right? And through those interpretive letters, open up the floodgates to like $1 trillion derivative market. At the time that I was nominee, before me was Brian Brooks, who was like a crypto guy. So the thing that he had done right before he left office is open up the banking sort of chambers to these crypto banks. And that was the issue, is that there was like the Amazon bank, there was like, Jack Dorsey's ex-bank. There's all of these fintech / crypto banks that were trying to get into the bank charter. And they were large donors to the Democratic Party, especially Sam Bankman-Fried. And if I'm guessing, it was his influence is the reason that I didn't get it, that nobody got it, right? No nominee was nominated.
Yeah, it's still an acting guy there, Michael Hsu, right?
Yeah, same with the FDIC is Marty Gruenberg, but he was just there. We never got a Senate confirmed, not for that, not for Treasury Undersecretary of Financial Affairs. And then when Sarah Bloom Raskin, if you remember, she was nominated for vice chair, she got outvoted by Manchin and Sinema, whatever, because she had suggested in a Wall Street Journal op-ed that banks should consider climate risk. And that was enough to tank her. And so I was essentially like, I saw what was before me. It's like I could go to the Senate, get crushed by whatever, Senator Kennedy accusing me of being like a communist or something, and still not have the votes. We just could not get the votes for whatever reason.
Can I just interject to say what you're describing about what the OCC has done and does are things that the same people who support deregulation freak out about if it's like the EPA writing rules or the Department of Labor writing rules or the Labor Relations Board. They're like, you don't have the authority to do that. And they go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, you absolutely don't have the authority to do that. But I don't see anything happening where anyone's challenging the OCC or the banking regulators on that.
Yeah. Well, first they challenge in court, and then they capture. And if you capture, you don't need to challenge. But there were some challenges to the OCC. And the OCC actually lost Chevron deference during the financial crisis. Like Dodd-Frank explicitly was like, you don't get deference anymore because you screwed up so much. It has the worst reputation of any banking agency.
So your agenda, had you been able to come in like Lina Khan and like shake things up, would have been to basically rewrite a bunch of those rules that it had written and say like, well, actually, I want to constrain what regulated banks can do, and they can and bring them back down to a more sort of local, less global derivative-based level.
Honestly, there's no way I could have done that much. I think all I could have done, and this would have been a huge success, was to not allow the fintech banks and the crypto banks to get in, like just to stop the hemorrhaging of the banking licenses out to these banks. And right now they're stalled, but there's still stuff happening. And, you know,
I feel like right now that happened with the failure of Signature Bank, which was it was always a normal bank, but then it got heavily into crypto and then it failed the same weekend as SVB, right? And then like the minute the Signature Bank fails, from that point forth, the chances of any bank doing anything in crypto is basically zero.
True. And, you know, I don't know what's going on with Amazon or that, because the one of Jack Dorsey's things, Square
there you
got
go.
an ILC.
Square wants to be a bank.
And it got that ILC charter. And I had written a lot about that. That's like this little loophole in like, it's like a Utah chartered bank that allows you input into the banking system. And that's what PayPal basically does. And so Square got its own bank and that was on hold. So those are the kind of things that I would be watching is, you know, you're trying to like rein in the monopolies. It would have been hard to rein in JP Morgan's monopoly, but you can at least prevent Amazon's monopoly from getting into our bank, like to be also a banking monopoly, right? So that was kind of, it would have been similar to Lina Khan's in that just like try to like hold up the, you know, like the guard a little bit, you know, because it's really eroding right now. We really, I think the fight is lost actually.
What fight exactly?
Against just big corporate like monopolies. I don't think we could rein them in politically if we wanted to. I don't think any nation could.
So one of my, you know, neoliberal beliefs from 20 years ago, 25 years ago, is Walmart should totally have a banking license.
I agree.
You agree with that? So
Yeah,
like Amazon, no, but Walmart, yes.
Yeah. At the time I wrote, my first paper was Walmart should get a banking license because, you know, I mean, yes, monopoly, but also what they were trying to do was actually provide bank accounts to their customers who don't have bank accounts. They weren't, you know, Walmart is Walmart. It's not like aiming for global domination. It's aiming for cross-selling to the max. So look, if JP Morgan, if Goldman was going to be a bank, let Walmart bank its customers. They were check cashing for like $1 rather than like 10. They were offering this green dot account with like $1 or $2 charge just for the underbanked and unbanked. I thought their bank would have been better. And it didn't have the same risks. If you have a, you know, JP Morgan with these little banks, you know, you have just finance, it's like extra risk. Walmart and its bank would have different kinds of risks. So I just didn't see the dangers in like a run on a Walmart bank like you would in another.
So what's so bad about the free market? I mean, I like that I can use an ATM and that, you know, $1 in Alabama is the same as $1 in New York. There seem to be benefits from a so-called free market, right? Like,
I'm not,
so bad.
yeah, it's not. I mean, I don't think that's just technology. My argument, first of all, isn't against the free market. It's not against technology. Those are good things. My argument is against corruption, to allow certain people with certain charters and lobbyists to get favorable treatment under the law and other people to not. Like the majority of taxes are paid for by the majority of people, while like there's like, you know, the top 0.5%, like I said, aren't even chartered in America, right? There isn't, you can buy laws, right? You can buy Supreme Court justices, right? Through, like, you got to long-term it, right? You got to get in the FedSoc and do all that stuff. So that's what I mean by neoliberalism has nothing to do with the free market. That's what I'm arguing against.
But they took that language and like co-opted it and
Exactly.
and use it to their advantage to unfree
Exactly.
the market.
Exactly. And so then we're stuck in this argument where the left is like, oh, we're anti-free market. And the right is like, oh, it's the Jews or something. And that's why I start my book with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is
the Jewish
reviving,
space lasers. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's me. I have one of those in my backyard.
Yeah. Well, it's like, that's when conspiracy theorists try to explain the problem by it's either, those guys, or it's the Mexicans, or it's this, because everyone kind of gets that something is messed up, and some people have wild imaginations, or maybe they're hucksters. I don't know what Marjorie Taylor Greene's like. I don't know if she actually thought that or she just said it, but that's the danger, really. And I think that's what I'm trying to say is like, let me explain it so that you don't come up with these other things, because I agree that something is messed up, but it's not capitalism. Capitalism has been unfairly blamed.
So if I can stay in like the regulatory wonky world just for a minute, because we had some very big news this week, which was this big report about the FDIC, which has seemingly incredibly fucked up and sexist internal culture. And from reading Emily Peck in Axios, what we need in order to be able to have some kind of grip on the regulatory infrastructure is all three major agencies, the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC, all voting in favor of things like Basel III Endgame and stuff like that can kind of maybe rein in financial institutions to some degree. And if Marty Gruenberg doesn't survive this FDIC scandal, then, well, Emily, you explain it because you understand it better than I do.
I thought you were almost done. You got it.
I was almost done.
The advocates in favor of financial regulation say that we can't lose Marty Gruenberg atop the FDIC because he was a key vote in passing financial regulations like Endgame, which is a great name for a boring thing that maybe is important, which asks that bank hold more capital. And the banking industry I think it's fair to say hates it and wants to crush it.
Yeah. Also, his successor would be Travis Hill, the Trump appointee, who's obviously anti more banking regulations.
So the question you're asking, Felix, is that true?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So the first question is it important for the regulatory agenda for Marty Gruenberg to keep his job?
I was on the transition team over FDIC, and we met a lot with Jelena McWilliams, who was the Trump appointee for FDIC, and Marty also. And what I heard from everybody below Jelena was that she had created this like us versus them. It was like her and her team versus, Marty was out over there because he was on the board. And mind you, we don't have the board should be like should have been 5 or 6 people. And there was no appointees there. And then he got put in Jelena's place. Again, not because we couldn't get Senate confirmation on anybody else. I'm kind of like, I don't care anymore because it's like, I want to know, I like Marty a lot. I think he's on the right side way more so than, Jelena was. She's the one that gave the ILC license. They stopped collecting data on things like underbanked people. She definitely had an ideological bent to her. They all do, I guess. And Marty's reasonable. He's been there for a while, but he's also been there for a while. And, I'm not surprised that he's allowed some of this stuff just because, that's the way that the FDIC is. The FDIC also has really low turnover, the low diversity because you're banking, like most of the agencies bank examiners. So it had some structural, cultural problems, no less than like the OCC, right?
You think if you go into the OCC and do a similar look, you're going to find,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The Wall Street Journal report that first came out and uncovered this, it was shocking. It was like reading about a bank from 1978. There's all these bank examiners. They're out on the road. They're going to hotels. They're getting really drunk. The male supervisors are constantly hitting on the women, the younger women, and getting mad if they don't reciprocate, crushing their careers. It's so bad. If that's what you're saying is also happening at the OCC, then that would have been your first agenda item when you started, forget regulation. It's so I've been sitting on it and thinking about it for a long time. And you said, the regulation almost doesn't matter, maybe because the financial regulation overall situation is so grim. So, okay. So then just maybe get rid of everyone in charge of this organization because it's clearly so corrupt and it's clearly so toxic, and at least just fix that. And you know what I mean? If we can't have good financial regulation, at least be nice to these poor women who are trying to work there,
It did. I mean, the diversity numbers were really bad, and we asked them about it because it's like and they talked to us about it. Like the idea was that people don't retire, and so you have like really good job security. And the FDIC is a very regional agency, so you've got people in like the Midwest who have. It's not like as sophisticated as some of the DC, New York City ones, right? So like some of the Me Too era like cleanups that happen maybe in other agencies closer to like. The press, New York City, didn't happen at the FDIC's. But I would be shocked if that weren't prevalent anywhere it's not like a particularly FDIC problem. I actually, going into it, I thought the FDIC was one of the better ones, just as far as like responsibility up the chain. Yes, there was a Yelena up top, but like the OCC had this, not in like culturally, but the OCC had this like long pattern of where they like lived at the bank. So you're partying with the bankers, right? So the OCC just like had the floor at Goldman Sachs, and they would just go like the revolving door was like one floor up, and so that seems to me worse than, well, not this, but then the FDIC being, this seems bad, but it's a different kind of bad than what I saw there, which was that just a total capture.
Slate Money is sponsored this week by Thorn, which helps you be in control of your health, which means helping you be super mindful of what you put in your body. From food to supplements, all of us are trying to find the best option out there, and that's where Thorn comes in. They take a personalized, innovative, and scientific approach to health and wellness. They manufacture all of their supplements in the US using top-notch ingredients sourced globally, whether it's their B complex, creatine, magnesium citrate, basic prenatal. Thorn's got all the supplements you need to help promote and maintain your health goals. I've been taking the Daily Greens Plus, which is designed to improve cellular health and energy production, as well as support for cognitive performance and having a clear head. If I said something intelligent on this podcast, maybe you can thank Daily Greens Plus from Thorn. So give your body what it really needs with Thorn. Go to thorn.fit/money and use the code MONEY for 10% off your first order. That's THORNE.FIT/money, code MONEY for 10% off your first order. Thorn.fit/money, code MONEY. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply. Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
So I want to use this to segue perfectly into the other question which I have, which is basically the health of the banking system broadly in the wake of all of these Fed hikes. But let me stick with the whole question of Basel Endgame for a minute, which is the idea behind Basel III Endgame is to increase the amount of capital that the biggest banks have to make them safer. And Michael Barr has this, very simple idea that if the more capital a bank has, the safer it is. And he's very keen that for that reason, end game is, in some form or another, maybe not in exactly its current form, needs to get passed. And so I guess my first question is he right about that? And, is that outcome now endangered more than it was before because of this whole FDIC mishigas?
I mean, probably. I like capital. That was Geithner's thing, right? The only thing that matters, capital. And maybe, but also Lehman was very well capitalized Thursday before the day. It was capitalized enough. You can lose capital very fast. Bank capital, we're talking, not regular capital. This is it's like a balance sheet equation, right? So you can quickly lose your asset values, especially if you're mark to market, you're not marking to market. I mean, it's a balance sheet item. So yes, 8%. We're never talking about a not Amati type capital. It's not 20, 30%. We're talking at a maximum. 8% capital for a bank, I think is like a cushion that disappears quickly. You saw with SVB, Signature Bank. I don't think the problem was capital, not enough capital. The problem was, you put risk on, you got the asset side, the liability side, you get a run and you're out, right?
Right. But anyway, so to your point, the asset side of a bank can evaporate very quickly, especially when there is a sudden hike in interest rates. And people are like, oh, you have a bond portfolio. I just wrote about Bank of America. Bank of America has a bond portfolio, which is full of mortgages, which yield 2.5%. That bond portfolio is held on its books because it's held to market, held to maturity at literally $125 billion more than it would fetch if you actually tried to sell it. That's $125 billion sort of mark-to-market hole in the Bank of America balance sheet. And if you subtract that amount from Bank of America's regulatory capital, you definitely find less capital there than a too-big-to-fail bank of that size should have. We just saw the failure of New York Community Bank. Virtually any bank with a balance sheet that has any kind of fixed rate assets on it has seen the asset side of its balance sheet severely hurt if you take it seriously and you don't just say it's held to maturity and therefore we can just hold it at par. So my question for you is, as a potential bank regulator, is that something that regulators and the public should be worried about?
The health of the banking sector? Absolutely. Or the safety capital? Yes, because bank runs, we saw this with SVB Bank. I mean, it's not just, okay, your assets go down, you were invested, but then Peter Thiel writes an email and is like, go take your money out of this bank, right? That's what it takes sometimes. And then the run could have spread very easily to, it took Signature, could have gone further than that. They were talking about a community banking run. It's about trust. And these are these psychological things. So yes, next time,
and that's where the OCC and the FDIC and the Treasury and the Fed all stepped in with this systemic risk exception, which was basically them saying, don't worry, we'll be there. We'll backstop everything, even if it's above the $250,000 limit in deposits. And so I guess, is that the answer then? We don't actually need to worry too much so long as we have some grown-ups in the room who are willing to do something like that?
I would say that the same idea, but differently in that in chapter 8 of the book, I talk about that. The stress test regime that's created after the financial crisis is neoliberalism is in action. Neoliberalism fails in 2008. Every assumption goes away. You've got Greenspan being like, I made a mistake, blah, blah, blah. And then here you regroup and put it into stress tests. And another way to see stress tests is it's basically the Fed, putting a stamp of approval on the top biggest banks to say, if you give us your books, we will tell the public that you're fine. And the implicit thing is that, which maybe you are, whatever, given their metrics, but it's all metrics. It's all risk management brought into the Fed. The same risk management that the banks were using to so-called hedge their risks, now the Fed is using to look across the market. And the implicit, I think, promise of all of those is that, yes, we will bail you out because you passed our stress test. And whatever happens to you after that is some systemic risk exception
right. / and it does work, right? So what you have is you have banks like Citigroup, to use the particularly notorious one, they would go along with their stress test to the Fed, and the Fed would be like, yeah, no, that's not good enough. Send it back. Come back. Citigroup would be like, well, how about this? And they were like, yeah, no, come back. And then eventually Citigroup would come back with something that would work. And they were like, okay, now we are willing to, basically keep you in this elite group of too big to fail banks. And everyone understands that too big to fail means you will get bailed out if you run into trouble. As Emily famously says on Slate Money more than once, like, too big to fail is good now.
It's good now.
It's good now.
It's like, that means the banks are safe. Whereas before it was bad because it meant they would take everyone down with them. Now it's like, it just means trust us. We'll save these guys. No one else gets a safety net, but the banks do.
But I think it's like they'll take the Fed down now. I mean, I just think we're now the banks are connected to the Fed, have always been. That's been my thesis from book one, is the banks and the Fed they're connected. Like one feeds the other and vice versa. And at this point, not in a bad way. That's just how banking works. It's like Walter Bagehot from England. Like you are, it's a partnership. And at this point, though, it's been like the Fed really subsidizing and then calling it capitalism, where really, I mean, in the COVID crisis, when the Treasury bond market froze, the Fed did more stimulus in that like 1-2 days than ever in 2008. It was like a huge full scale money dump into the banking system.
Right. That was like basically all of Adam Tooze's book was about that. It's just like, if you don't understand the COVID recession through the lens of monetary policy, you don't understand the COVID recession.
I mean, I think, Adam called it like bazookas or something, like full scale. We're going to buy up all the Treasury. I mean, it's not just buying up Treasury, but it's every single program that they created over months during the financial crisis was right there to be used. And just, you push a button, you got the market, you got, here's the money markets, here's this, here's that, here's that. It's just what the financial crisis taught the Fed how to do is to save the banks. Now.
Yeah. And now the Fed has 5.25% interest rates. And what that means is, because they no longer do like open market operations, the way that the Fed sets interest rates now is just by printing money. Whenever a bank has excess reserves on deposit at the New York Fed, they earn 5.25% on those reserves. And so you put, $1 billion on deposit at the Fed, you wake up, a year later and you've made $50 million just in risk-free returns from the Fed. And that is a great way to keep the banks relatively happy.
But what's wrong with keeping the banks healthy, actually? Because, I mean, we talked about SVB a ton on Slate Money. And, I think we came away saying like, oh, the regulatory system worked. Like, there wasn't a run on all the banks. Like, everything got shored up and the contagion didn't spread. That was good. But now I feel like you're saying it's not good.
It's good if the banks are serving the economy. It's good if the banks are like following the rules. I mean, the problem with SVB was that they were saying, oh, we're not like the other banks. These deposits that we have, they were under the 250. So they weren't paying in to the FDIC insurance fund the same as other banks because they said their deposits weren't like other banks. And that's the problem with these crypto banks is like, give us this exception. That was like the carve out, the Crapo carve out, right? But the problem is, and this was all of the banks pre-financial crisis, is that Goldman wasn't a bank. Lehman wasn't a bank. They were like, we're not runnable. We've hedged our risks in derivatives. And there was a run on these investment banks and the Fed comes in to bail them out. And so it's just calling a thing a thing. It's like, if we want to subsidize all of our banks, which I think we are and we should, let's just call it that and let them pay for it. And let us have a democracy rather than just like a hush hush. We'll pretend like you guys are a free market. And also, like, if we're going to do this, then let us demand that they give everyone loans that deserves them and not favor certain clients over others, right?
So it's the pretending that like is so toxic. It's like if we would only admit that like the banks are heavily regulated and managed and they're not
subsidized
free capitalist entities, then like we could do some other stuff.
That's like the whole thing I'm saying is that.
Okay. So let's have a numbers round here because I feel like I'm just the king of the segue this week. And I'm going to start my number with this is going to be a very rare question number. My number is $25 million. And that is the amount of FDIC insurance that Steve Mnuchin thinks that we should have at banks. That we should raise the FDIC insurance deposit limit from $250,000 to $25 million. which, and I'm just going to put this to Mehrsa, like, from what you're saying, I kind of think you think that would be a good idea. It would force all of the banks who are basically free riding with uninsured deposits to pay up on that and to be more regulated.
Again, it's like call a thing a thing. If there isn't a true cap, then raise it, because it wasn't. People said that. There's no way they're going to let them fail above 250. You can't. That's not how this works. And so if you're not going to let them fail above 250, then you pay for whatever deposits you have. And then that's absolutely right.
So I like this. We have managed to find some common ground here between Mehrsa Baradaran and Steve Mnuchin.
Stop class.
Fine. There's probably more.
We're big Steve fans on this podcast. Let's just admit it.
He is one of the heroes of my book. But Elizabeth, what's your number?
My number is 28,000, and that's the number of hazardous fragments from satellites in low Earth orbit that the FAA expects to survive reentry by 2035.
Oh, no.
We have a big space junk problem. And they also estimate that it will probably kill one person on the ground every 2 years.
Oh, no.
Which, if you weren't walking around with enough things to worry about, you might get hit by a piece of the...
Another reason not to go outside.
Is this the opening scene of Donnie Darko? Something just like falls out of space.
Right.
And it has happened recently. There was a piece of the ISS that hit a house in Naples, like last year.
God.
Florida or Italy?
Florida.
I'm glad that the ISS is doing the good NASA thing and landing its space junk in the United States rather than in a storied old city in Italy. Emily, what's your number?
My number is 55.2. That is a percentage. It is the labor force participation rate in West Virginia, the second lowest in the country. And that the labor force participation rate, as people know, that's the share of, in this case, 16 people age 16 and older who are working or looking for work. So not a lot of people working or looking for work in West Virginia. And the Wall Street Journal had this really good story earlier this week about West Virginia's kind of like labor dilemma. They're losing population. They're getting really old over in West Virginia, and like they don't have enough people working there. But at the same time, the governor is like banning sanctuary cities in the state and like sending the West Virginia National Guard to the Mexican border to like keep the migrants away. But like perhaps no other state in the country needs immigrants more than this one. Like they can't keep like restaurants open in some counties because there's no one to work at them. The elderly die waiting for like a home health care aid. Like they're on waiting lists to have like someone come and help them because there's like no immigrants. And it just seemed like it's a really interesting story. I almost feel like it's like a story of a state's self-own or something.
So Mehrsa, whisper it. What is your number?
It's 44,580,826, which is the amount of downloads that Not Like Us has.
Thank you. Thank you, Mehrsa, for bringing us home with. And how many streams of that have been streamed in the Mehrsa Baradaran Spotify?
Oh my gosh! Just today, like 6, but all week it's just such a good beat. It's such a great song. I mean, Meet the Grams, Not Like Us, they're both on repeat this week for me.
So that's the side of the beef. You're on that side of the beef.
I'm just going to ask you, because we have you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how cynical do you think this is? Everyone knows that rat beefs are the way to get like a whole bunch of downloads and money and like reignite a genre that was feeling a little bit long in the tooth. So do you think this has all been kind of orchestrated somehow, or do you think this is real?
As I'm going to paraphrase Kendrick Lamar, it says, "This is not a rap battle. It's a lifelong battle with yourself battle." I think Kendrick Lamar could not like Meet the Grams. They not like, this is like pent up frustration with the bullshit of Drake for many, many years. Like, I don't think it was like, no, I think, I mean, I'm a fan of Kendrick Lamar. I've always could not stand Drake. So I'm like, this is just like nectar to my soul. I'm loving it. However, so no, I don't think it was drummed up. Like, do I think Taylor Swift and the Kelsey, whatever, do I think that was fake? Yes, I do. So I'm not above like thinking that like celebrities are paid to like drum stuff up, but I'm going to go with his lyrics were too on the nose to have been, you can tell like it was like he'd been stewing on this for so long that it just came out like hot, So yeah, So my answer is no, but I don't know. I'm not that cynical, actually. Despite all of my writing, I tend to
despite just having written a 500-page book that is full of rim of cynicism, like when it comes to Kendrick, that's where we draw the line.
I'm shocked by my naivety sometimes when it comes to the people I like.
On that note, I think that's it for the regular show this week. Thank you, Mehrsa, so much for being on the show. Thank you to all of you guys for listening and sending in your emails, slatemoney@slate.com. Thanks to Shana Roth and Jared Downing for producing. And we will be back next week with more Slate Money.
There was a time when sunlight turned the earth into a gallery, when elegant estates welcomed works of art that drew us closer and closer together. It was a captivating time. It was spring, this spring at Biltmore. Plan your visit or overnight stay so you can enjoy the marvelous works of Chihuly while every corner of Biltmore blooms. Reserve now to get spring savings at Biltmore.com.